Andrew Benioff here with the Aikido Vanguards project. Today, I am very pleased to have David Farrell Sensei join us, who is a 7th Dan Shihan with the Shinkaze Aikido Alliance, based out of Massachusetts. Farrell Sensei, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
We're here to talk primarily about you and your relationship with your long-standing teacher, Kanai Mitsunari Sensei. If you could give us some background on when you first met Kanai Sensei and how you began training, it would be great.
Yeah, so I can remember it was in June of 1969. I graduated from high school on a Wednesday, and that Friday was when I first started doing Aikido. I had a summer job, so I had transportation and I had the ability to pay dues. So martial arts were kind of frowned upon in my family. I think my mother was afraid I'd become a hoodlum. And so I just started doing Aikido. And it's interesting that I had my choice. I could have started Aikido on that Friday or waited 2 weeks and started in the judo class. They kind of put them on an interval on a schedule. But I chose Aikido because it was, a week and a half sooner. I started training then, and that was at a satellite dojo of New England Aikikai. Of course, Kanai Sensei was at New England Aikikai. This is a satellite dojo. One of his senior students conducted classes, and then once a month, Kanai Sensei would come out and see us, and he'd have a class. So I first saw him in June of 1969. He scared me half to death.
Why is that?
Well, he was like, so at that time I was 17. So I think he was 30, 31. And he was like, not like you remember him now when he was older. He was like young and shape with these massive arms, and he was fast and it was scary. He was very nice, but he was scary. So when he came out to see us, once a month, it was a big deal, and everyone would show up, and all his senior students would come, and they're all these big guys, and he was my size. He and I were about exactly the same height, and so he was tossing these guys around, and they were all out of breath, and their gis were coming undone, and their hakamas were falling off, and I go, all right, that's cool. So then I practiced at the satellite dojo. Through college, I practiced when I could, went away to school, went away to graduate school. At graduate school, they had a club. That's where I met Paul Sylvain. And that was before he went to Japan, both Paul and Lorraine. And then after that, when I moved back to the area after graduate school, I ended up starting a dojo for a couple years with one of his senior students one of Kanai Sensei's senior students in Andover. And that lasted a few years. And then I just went to New England Aikikai, and I was with Kanai Sensei until he passed away.
So, Farrell Sensei, how long were you a direct student of Kanai Sensei, and how often did you have direct instruction with him?
It varied over the whole time. I was at NEA starting in about 1978 up until 2004. I left for a couple of years to do another stint at graduate school. But in that period, there were times, for the bulk of that period, I was there 5 nights a week, 4 nights a week. And then when, daughter came along, it was less, but I always kept my hand there. And then eventually, I was there, practiced for a long time. When I was about Sandan, which would have been in 1983, I started teaching there regularly. Yeah, so I guess it's up and down, but there was during the bulk of my period from about Nidan through 4th, 5th Dan, I was there 4 or 5 nights a week, and then it tapered off with family responsibilities, that sort of thing. But I still had a class, and I was still there to practice. There was a time when I was just going once a week, but once a week full of Kanai Sensei, if you're conscientious, can work.
So it sounds like you were probably a direct student of his for more than 25 years.
Yeah, 25 years. Yeah.
I don't believe you were ever a live-in student. Were there live-in students at the dojo?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
And was there ever a program? Did Kanai Sensei ever sort of articulate any kind of a program for, like Chiba Sensei did with Ken Shusei or anything like that, that was special to become an instructor or anything like that?
No, he presented Aikido and let everybody practice together. Out of that, the classes kind of stratified, and then he'd find people to teach and just go from there. But he was very like learn by watching. Yeah, he would not say a lot. He would put the responsibility on his students, and I think it worked. I mean, there were times when people were frustrated that they'd see other programs like that, and we didn't have anything like that. But I think in the end it worked. He always was, and this is one of the reasons why I really liked him as a teacher. He was always, I'm not going to tell you, you have to find it. Kind of, you have to steal from me, watch what I'm doing and steal from me. And I think like your retention rate is much better when you have to figure it out yourself.
I'm going to ask you to describe your teacher, if you would. If you could give us 3 adjectives that describe Kanai Sensei and explain to us why they're important and how Kanai Sensei personified these traits.
I think the first would be like efficient. Kanai Sensei could be dazzling when he did Aikido. I mean, his hair used to move in sequence with his hakama. And he wasn't a big guy, but he was very, very efficient, and it looked dazzling. But what it really was he understood like body mechanics, and he was able to use those body mechanics to his advantage. In judo, they talk about kazushi and using maximum leverage. In Aikido, they talk about shakaku, moving into someone's blind spot. But all these things working together is like a very efficient use of human physiology. And I never got that. And in fact, I didn't get that. Oh, I never got it completely, I'm sure. But I didn't even begin to understand till I went for a time and did some judo in college. They spend a lot of time learning how to off balance your opponent before you try to throw them. And it's kind of it's along the same lines. And it wasn't until I read Kanai Sensei's technical Aikido paper that he says, I have it right here, but one must understand that Aikido training should be solely based on this uncompromising principle of maximum efficiency arising from human physiology. To me, over every other teacher I'd seen at summer camps and all that sort of thing, that to me was the manifestation of what it was all about. That's where the magic came from. It wasn't like some mystical power coming out of the ground or anything like that. It was just maximum efficiency. So that's the first adjective I would use with Kanai Sensei. The second is he was very serious, right? He was very serious about Aikido. I mean, he could joke around and have a good time, but he always took Aikido very, very, very seriously. Like etiquette to him was as important as training. He liked people who were training seriously. He often used to say, and I've said this before, he often used to say, some people practice for 10 years and other people practice for 1 year 10 times. So there's this element of taking class, taking training very seriously that's almost self-reflective in the sense that you're saying, you're trying to figure out what works best for you. Because if you go back to the efficiency and human physiology, everyone's human physiology is different. So there's this assimilation step in your training where you have to figure out what works for you, what works for your body, right? And like I'm about 5'8", when Paul Sylvain was what, 6'2" or something. I mean, it was crazy. There are some techniques that wouldn't be my first choice, right? So you have to figure that stuff out. So there's kind of like this assimilation step. And I've often said, like in my own experience, and this is just my own experience, that I learned a lot of Aikido when I wasn't in class. I learned a lot of Aikido training with a training partner off by ourselves, just training, off class times, before class, after class, that kind of thing. We were going through the steps of trying to figure out what he was doing, what Sensei was doing when he did this, and how can we do that? What works for me versus what doesn't work for me. So I think that whole assimilation step, I think, is very important and sometimes missing today. So that would be my second adjective, very serious. He took Aikido very seriously, and that was good. You want that in a teacher, right? So, and the third thing is, I think he was also very flexible. What I mean by that is that when he first came to the United States, I know they brought him over. It wasn't under the best circumstances. I think that the people who brought Kanai Sensei to Boston sort of let other people believe that they had a lot more students than they did. They were a lot bigger and that sort of thing. And Sensei showed up, couldn't speak English very well. And he really had been, I don't know if hoodwinked is the best word, but it might be. But he persevered, he just, okay, this is what I do. And he got some students and eventually was successful. But along the way, there were people who I think took advantage of him. We had a big tax problem at the dojo, that was a problem. And we had a very disastrous move at the dojo, and there was always like all these setbacks. And I mean, if I had been him, I would have given up, but he didn't. And so he was very, and he eventually came out. He ended up, having a family that he was happy with, and he, became successful, but a lot of perseverance there. So those are the three adjectives I would say: efficiency, seriousness, and flexibility.
What did Kanai Sensei have to say about his teachers or others in preceding generations?
I don't know a lot. I'll tell you what I do know, but because my relationship with Kanai Sensei, we didn't like talk a lot. I mean, we traveled a couple times and we hung out. We're very polite, and I love the guy, right? But we didn't like really talk about that sort of thing. I always felt everyone was always asking him questions. I'm not going to ask him many questions. I asked him very, very few questions, except on the mat. I have a lot of questions. But one of the things I do know, I know, like I was I was traveling with it one time, right? And we went out to the West Coast, and we're sitting at the airport. And I told him, I said, Sensei, I found this book. I went on this long story about how I found this judo book that was out of print, an old-time book, and by Kyozo Mifune, who was like the tactician in judo at the Kodokan, 10th Dan. And I, went on this whole thing. I go, I got this book for $10. It was out of print. They didn't know how much it was worth. It's worth hundreds of dollars. And the pictures are great. The translation's terrible. And I said, did you ever know him? Did you ever see him? He goes, yeah, Sensei and I went to his dojo. We did a demonstration over there. So they knew him, right? So it's just really funny. He was really well connected. But what I do know, like he was, uke for Arakawa Sensei for a long time. And we loved Arakawa Sensei. He came to summer camp in the late 70s. and he was scary. But I know Sensei was actually, there's an interesting story there. When Arakawa Sensei came, and this was in the late 70s, to summer camp, we didn't know who he was. And we knew he was like, like a 6th dan in karate or something. And, he looked kind of, he was kind of middle-aged at the time. All right. So there was this morning class. I missed morning class, so this was good. I was happy I missed it. But you probably know this story because you're smiling, right? But that's okay. His uke came over from Europe, and some guy he had some relationship with to take ukemi. So first thing in the morning, he Arakawa Sensei is like wailing on him, hitting him really hard. And eventually the uke had to go home. There was some sort of issue. I don't know what the issue was. And, I didn't want to know. I just wanted to stay out of it. So, so later on in that summer camp, they had a meeting, and I wasn't at the meeting, but it was the talk of the camp. So this is what happened. Now this was in the 70s. It was a little bit different. People would practice Aikido. It was a little like I don't know how to describe it. It's like kind of like countercultural hippie kind of people. Like that's what they were doing. That was their thing. That's fine. And so they had this meeting, and so Arakawa Sensei would be interviewed at this meeting. Professor Uno from Smith College, who was a Asian studies teacher at Smith, he was the translator. He was a great guy. And he was translating for Arakawa Sensei. And, it had to happen, right? Someone had to ask the question, said, well, something along the lines of, well, why did you beat up your uke, right? Last Monday or whatever it was. And then, you could probably hear a pin drop. And, no one said anything, and Professor Uno said, I'm not going to translate that question. And there was dead silence. And then Kanai Sensei said, I have something to say, which was like a shock because he never said much, right? In those times, I have something to say. And he stood up and he kind of resolved the situation by saying, those are the kinds of questions you need to ask yourself, right? You need to find your own answer. When I heard about that, I said, okay, that's really cool, because that goes back to the seriousness part I was talking about, because that's like personal responsibility. You need to take responsibility for finding your own answers to why something like that would happen. So I thought that was a cool story. So I remember Arakawa Sensei, and I remember, what he said about Tamura Sensei, but that really is about it that I can remember right now.
Farrell Sensei, can you go back? You talked about Mifune Kyuzo Sensei, yes. And then you also talked about Arikawa Sensei, and you just mentioned
Tamura Sensei.
Tamura Sensei. You just mentioned Tamura Sensei, but you didn't say anything about him, or maybe you did when your video went out. But if you could, anything you could talk about Tamura Sensei would be lovely.
So like I said, I don't know a lot, but I do know that when we were inviting Tamura Sensei over to camp one time, we're having a discussion, and Kanai Sensei said he was a sensei. So it's like all those guys looked up to Tamura Sensei, and I can see why. Tamura Sensei was great, right? So that's all I know about that.